Four friends descended into a forgotten Appalachian mine, chasing a rumor of a sealed, undocumented subterranean bunker. Only one came back. When rescue teams finally pulled Sarah Jenkins from the earth 6 days later, she was clutching a rusted key and whispering a secret that defied logic. This is her story. The air in the Appalachian Mountains was unusually humid for late October when Sarah Jenkins parked her Subaru near the overgrown trailhead. Beside her sat David Miller, a 28-year-old structural engineer whose obsession with urban exploration bordered on the fanatic. In the back seat were Ryan O'Connor, a childhood friend with a penchant for adrenaline, and Chloe Davies, an amateur documentary filmmaker who had insisted on hauling a heavy DSLR camera and a battery-powered floodlight into the woods. Their target was the Blackwood Shaft, a long-abandoned coal mine in West Virginia that had been sealed off in the 1970s. But David wasn't interested in the coal. He had spent months analyzing old geological survey maps and scouring obscure internet forums, piecing together a wild theory. He believed the Blackwood Shaft intersected with an unrecorded Cold War-era government fallout shelter, built in secret and hastily abandoned. "We are standing on the edge of history," David told the group as they strapped on their helmets and checked their headlamps. Sarah, a 27-year-old ER nurse, felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She was the cautious one, the designated medic of their excursions. She had packed extra gauze, splints, and iodine, though she hoped they wouldn't need them. The entrance to the mine was a jagged tear in the side of a limestone cliff, half hidden by dying kudzu vines. Local cavers called this specific entrance the Devil's Throat because of the way the wind howled through the narrow fissures, sounding like a dying breath. The initial descent was grueling. For the first 2 hours, the four friends navigated through a labyrinth of decaying wooden support beams and flooded tunnels. The water was freezing, seeping through their boots and chilling them to the bone. Chloe kept her camera rolling, capturing the eerie, dancing shadows cast by their headlamps against the claustrophobic walls. At a depth of roughly 400 feet below the surface, the natural limestone and rough-hewn rock abruptly stopped. David's headlamp illuminated something that made the entire group freeze. It was a wall of smooth, poured concrete, completely incongruous with the 19th century mine they had been crawling through. In the center of the concrete was a massive, rusted steel blast door. There were no handles, just a heavy mechanical wheel covered in decades of dust and orange oxidation. "I told you," David whispered, his voice trembling with vindication. "I told you, it was real." Ryan, never one to hesitate, stepped forward and grabbed the wheel. With a harsh, metallic groan that echoed deafeningly down the mineshaft, the wheel turned. It took the combined strength of Ryan and David to heave the massive steel door open. A rush of stale, metallic-smelling air blew past them. It smelled of ozone, dry rot, and something else, something distinctly chemical. "We shouldn't go in there," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Her instincts were screaming at her. "The structural integrity of this area is entirely unknown, David." "Just 10 minutes, Chloe pleaded, holding up her camera. "We document the entrance, we prove it exists, and we leave." Against Sarah's better judgment, they stepped over the threshold. The space beyond the door was a long, concrete corridor lined with ancient, heavy-duty electrical conduits. Metal doors lined the hallway, most of them welded shut. It was a subterranean ghost town. They walked down the corridor for about 50 yards, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the secret facility. Then, the earth violently betrayed them. It started as a low, subsonic rumble that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Before anyone could shout a warning, a deafening crack tore through the air. The ceiling of the 19th century mineshaft behind them had failed. The shockwave of thousands of tons of collapsing rock and soil threw them to the concrete floor. A suffocating cloud of pulverized limestone and concrete dust billowed into the corridor, plunging them into absolute, choking darkness. Sarah coughed violently, blindly reaching for her helmet, which had been knocked off in the fall. "Sound off!" she screamed over the lingering rumble of falling debris. "I'm here!" Chloe yelled, coughing heavily. "I'm good," David rasped. There was a long, terrifying pause. "Ryan?" Sarah called out. From the darkness, near the blast door, a wet, agonizing scream ripped through the silence. Sarah scrambled toward the sound, her hands frantically patting the dust-covered floor until she found her helmet. She slapped the side of it, and the headlamp flickered back to life. The beam cut through the thick dust to reveal a nightmare. The steel blast door had been violently shoved forward by the cave-in. Beyond it, the mine shaft they had used to enter was completely gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of crushed rock. They were sealed inside. But worse, the heavy steel door had caught Ryan's lower leg as it buckled under the immense pressure. His tibia was shattered, the bone protruding through his tearing jeans. Blood was pooling rapidly on the cold concrete. They hadn't just discovered a secret tunnel. They were buried alive inside it. Panic is a contagious disease, and in a sealed underground room with rapidly depleting oxygen, it spreads like wildfire. Sarah immediately shifted into her professional element. She tore open her medical kit, her hands trembling but precise. "Chloe, hold the light steady," she ordered. Chloe, sobbing and hyperventilating, directed her headlamp onto Ryan's mangled leg. David stood frozen against the concrete wall, staring blankly at the thousands of tons of rock that now separated them from the sky. "David, I need you here," Sarah snapped. She applied a tourniquet just above Ryan's knee, twisting it tight. Ryan screamed until his voice gave out, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. Sarah packed the open wound with hemostatic gauze, but she knew the grim reality. Down here, in a bacteria-rich environment, with no sterile operating room, the trauma and blood loss would kill him long before dehydration did. "He needs a hospital," David muttered, finally snapping out of his daze. "We have to dig." "With what, David? Our fingernails?" Sarah shot back, securing the bandages. "That's solid bedrock and collapsed limestone. We are hundreds of feet underground. Our only chance is finding another way out through this facility." It took 2 hours to stabilize Ryan enough to move him. They fashioned a crude drag litter out of an old canvas tarp they found in a nearby storage closet. The reality of their situation was setting in. They had 3 headlamps, 4 spare batteries, 2 liters of water, and a handful of protein bars. They began to slowly navigate deeper into the bunker. The corridor opened up into a larger command center. It was a scene frozen in time. Banks of dead, glass-screened computer monitors from the 1960s covered the walls. Rows of steel desks were littered with decaying paperwork, rotary phones, and ashtrays still holding the remnants of cigars. It was undeniably a military or intelligence installation, but there was no insignia, no flags, no identifying marks anywhere. As the hours bled into a day, the psychological toll began to fracture the group. Time became a meaningless concept in the absolute, total darkness. They only used 1 headlamp at a time, on the lowest setting to conserve battery. The silence was heavy, broken only by Ryan's feverish moans and the occasional drip of condensation. David, desperate to regain control of the situation he had put them in, became erratic. He started aggressively prying open locked file cabinets and forcing open rusted doors down adjacent hallways, wasting precious energy. "We need to find the ventilation shafts," David insisted, his eyes wild in the dim light of his headlamp. "This place was built for human habitation. There has to be an intake shaft leading to the surface." "You're exhausting yourself," Sarah warned him, offering him a tiny sip from their dwindling water supply. "If you sweat, you lose hydration. We have to sit still and wait for rescue." "No one knows we're down here, Sarah," David shouted, his voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. "I didn't file a trip plan. It was an illegal site. No one is coming." The admission hit Sarah and Chloe like a physical blow. Chloe dropped her camera, burying her face in her hands. The thin veneer of hope they had been clinging to shattered completely. By the 3rd day, Ryan's fever spiked. Infection was ravaging his body. He was delirious, whispering conversations with people who weren't there. Sarah sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, feeling utterly helpless. That evening, or what they assumed was evening, David made a discovery that shifted their situation from a tragic accident to something deeply sinister. While forcing open a heavy metal door labeled sub-level storage, David found a room that was entirely different from the rest of the bunker. The walls here were lined with deep scratch marks. In the center of the room, chained to a heavy steel ring in the floor, was a skeletal remain dressed in rotting canvas coveralls. Chloe screamed when the flashlight beam swept over the skull. "Someone was locked in here," David whispered, stepping back. "This isn't a fallout shelter. It's a prison. A heavy, suffocating dread settled over them. The air seemed to grow colder. As they backed out of the room, shutting the door behind them, a sound echoed from the far end of the pitch-black corridor. It was the distinct, metallic sound of a heavy latch sliding into place. They froze. Sarah killed the headlamp immediately, plunging them into total darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest like a jackhammer. They held their breath, straining to listen. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing on the concrete, coming from the unexplored depths of the bunker. David grabbed a heavy rusted pipe he had found earlier. "Who's there?" he yelled into the dark, his voice cracking with terror. The footsteps stopped. A low, distorted, mechanical humming sound filled the corridor, like an old generator struggling to turn over. Suddenly, a row of ancient, yellowed emergency lights flickered on down the hallway, illuminating a section of the bunker they hadn't reached yet. And standing directly beneath the furthest light, perfectly still, was a figure in a yellow hazmat suit, staring right at them. The yellow, rubberized material of the hazmat suit was stained, peeling, and cracked with decades of age. Behind the heavy glass visor, nothing was visible but a suffocating darkness. The figure stood absolutely motionless under the sickly yellow glow of the emergency light, a silent sentinel in the bowels of the earth. "Run," Sarah breathed, the word barely escaping her throat. When the figure slowly raised a heavy, steel wrench in its right hand, the spell of shock shattered. "Move! Grab the tarp," Sarah screamed. She and Chloe hauled Ryan's makeshift stretcher with a surge of adrenaline they didn't know they possessed. David, dropping his rusted pipe in his panic, bolted ahead of them. They blindly scrambled back toward the main command center, the drag litter scraping violently against the concrete. Ryan cried out in agony with every jolt, but they couldn't slow down. Behind them, the emergency lights began to pop, blowing out one by one. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the figure's rubber boots echoed through the corridor, unhurried but relentless. They reached the command center, and David threw his weight against the heavy steel door, slamming it shut just as the corridor plunged into total darkness again. He threw the heavy deadbolt, collapsing against the cold metal, gasping for air. "What was that?" Chloe sobbed uncontrollably, dropping to the floor and curling into a fetal position. "David, what is down here with us?" "I don't know," David shouted back, pulling at his hair. His facade of the confident explorer was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped animal. "It's a squatter! Some lunatic who found a way in." "He had a hazmat suit, David," Sarah said, her voice shaking but forcing itself into a clinical, detached tone. She knelt beside Ryan. The frantic escape had reopened his wound. The makeshift bandages were soaked through with fresh, bright red blood. That wasn't a squatter. That suit was military issue. Old. Day 4 brought a horrifying descent into hell. Without ventilation, the air in the command center grew thick and foul, laced with the metallic tang of blood and the sour stench of human sweat and fear. Dehydration was ravaging their bodies. Sarah's tongue felt like sandpaper, and her vision frequently blurred at the edges. They were rationing the last few drops of their water, but it wasn't enough. But the worst torment was Ryan. The infection had moved into his bloodstream. Sepsis was shutting his organs down. His skin was mottled and cold, his breathing reduced to shallow, wet rasps. Sarah sat beside him in the pitch black. They had turned off the headlamps to save the final battery, holding his clammy hand. She was an ER nurse. She had saved dozens of lives. But down here, without IV antibiotics, without a surgical suite, she was entirely powerless. "Sarah," Ryan whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I'm here, Rye. I'm right here," she murmured, tears carving clean tracks through the dust on her face. "It's so cold," he mumbled. "Tell my mom. Tell her." His voice faded into a soft sigh. Sarah waited for the next inhale. It never came. She sat in the darkness, her fingers pressed against his carotid artery, waiting for a pulse that had vanished forever. When Sarah finally turned on the headlamp and shook her head, the silence in the room became absolute. Chloe let out a whimpering, keen, burying her face in her hands. David, however, didn't cry. He stared at Ryan's lifeless body, his eyes wide, pupils blown out in the dim light. Something fundamental snapped behind David's eyes in that moment. The guilt of leading his best friend to a slow, agonizing death broke his mind. "He's going to pay," David muttered, his voice eerily calm. "David, stop," Sarah warned, sensing the dangerous shift in his demeanor. "That guy out there." "The one in the suit," David said, pacing the room like a caged tiger. "He has water. He has food. He knows the way out. He's probably been laughing at us this whole time." David walked over to the corner and picked up a heavy, cast-iron leg from a broken desk. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I'm going to kill him," David stated. "I'm going to beat him to death and take his keys, and we are going to walk out of here." "David, no! It's suicide!" Chloe screamed, lunging for his legs, but he kicked her away roughly. Before Sarah could intervene, David unlocked the heavy deadbolt and slipped out into the pitch-black corridor. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. Sarah rushed forward to grab the handle, but David had jammed something into the mechanism from the outside. They were locked in. For 20 agonizing minutes, Sarah and Chloe sat in terrified silence, listening. Then, it started. From deep within the bunker, a roar of sheer rage echoed through the concrete walls, David's voice. It was followed by the sickening, heavy thud of metal striking concrete. Then came a sound that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. A wet, tearing crunch, followed by a scream of such primal, agonizing terror that it didn't even sound human. The scream was abruptly cut short. Then, silence returned. Heavy, suffocating, and absolute. "He's dead," Chloe whispered, her eyes vacant, staring at the locked door. "David is dead. We're going to die down here, Sarah. We're going to be skeletons chained to the floor." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, fighting off a wave of dizziness. She was running on fumes, her body consuming its own muscle for energy. But a fierce, stubborn spark of survival ignited in her chest. She wasn't going to die in the dark. "No," Sarah rasped, gripping her medical shears. "We are getting out." By the 5th day, reality began to fracture. Sarah experienced vivid auditory hallucinations. She heard hospital monitors beeping, the chatter of her colleagues at the nurse's station, and the sound of rain falling on a tin roof. Chloe had retreated entirely into her own mind. She sat in the corner, clutching her dead DSLR camera, whispering to it as if giving an interview for a documentary that would never be made. "The psychological decay happens rapidly," Chloe mumbled to the unblinking glass lens. "Subject A is unresponsive. Subject B is exhibiting signs of paranoia." "Chloe, drink," Sarah commanded weakly, forcing the last few drops of water from their plastic bottle into Chloe's cracked lips. Suddenly, a harsh, metallic scrape echoed from the hallway. Sarah froze. The noise was right outside their door. Someone was slowly, methodically sliding the blockage out of the door handle. Sarah killed their headlamp. The darkness swallowed them whole. She backed away from the door, dragging Chloe into the space beneath a massive row of computer mainframes. Sarah gripped her medical shears tightly, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The deadbolt clicked. The heavy steel door creaked open. A beam of blinding white LED light swept across the room. It wasn't the dull yellow of their headlamps. This was a modern, high-powered tactical flashlight. The beam illuminated Ryan's covered body, the rusted desks, and finally settled on the spot where Sarah and Chloe hid. "I know you're in here," a voice rasped. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a mutant. It was a man. The figure stepped into the room. He had discarded the yellow hazmat suit, wearing instead a pair of grimy tactical pants and a heavy wool sweater. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with wild, unkempt gray hair and a face deeply lined with years of madness and isolation. Around his neck hung David's bloody headlamp. Hanging from his heavy leather belt was a ring holding a single, massive, rusted key. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the man said, his tone almost conversational, as if he were scolding children. "My father spent his whole life keeping the devil's throat sealed. The sickness is still down here, you see. Project Jericho. It never sleeps." His name, as Sarah would later learn from the classified documents recovered from the site, was Elias Wyatt. He was the son of the bunker's original lead biochemist. When the government abandoned the facility in 1974, after a catastrophic chemical leak, the real reason the entrance was sealed, Elias's father had stayed behind out of guilt, going mad in the darkness. Elias had eventually found his father's hidden access tunnel descending into the bunker to live out a paranoid delusion as the caretaker of the quarantine zone. "You let the bad air out," Elias muttered, raising a heavy, blood-stained wrench, the same one he had used on David. "Now I have to sanitize the area. Standard procedure." As Elias stepped forward, his flashlight beam wavering, Chloe suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. With a primal, ear-piercing shriek, she lunged from beneath the desk. "Leave her alone!" Chloe screamed, slamming her heavy DSLR camera directly into Elias's face. The impact cracked the heavy flashlight, sending a spiderweb of shadows across the room. Elias stumbled backward, dropping the wrench, his nose shattered and bleeding profusely. But the old man possessed a wiry, terrifying strength fueled by decades of madness. He grabbed Chloe by the throat, hoisting her off the ground with a sickening ease. "Chloe!" Sarah shrieked, scrambling out from under the desk. Elias slammed Chloe backward against the sharp steel corner of the mainframe. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Chloe went entirely limp, sliding to the concrete floor like a discarded rag doll, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. Sarah didn't think. The clinical, cautious nurse evaporated, replaced by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. As Elias turned toward her, reaching for his dropped wrench, Sarah launched herself at him. She didn't go for the weapon, she went for the man. Using her knowledge of human anatomy, she drove the heavy, stainless steel blades of her trauma shears directly into the brachial artery under his right armpit. Elias let out a wet, gurgling gasp. His eyes went wide with shock as the artery severed. Arterial spray painted the concrete wall in an arc. He staggered backward, his hands frantically clutching at his armpit, trying to stem the massive blood loss. Sarah didn't wait to watch him fall. She scrambled forward, her fingers slick with his blood, and ripped the heavy ring from his belt. The rusted key clattered against the floor. She snatched it up and ran. She fled the command center, leaving the dying caretaker, her murdered friends, and the ghosts of Project Jericho behind her. She ran down the dark corridor, guided only by the dying amber glow of the emergency lights. She followed the signs that read ventilation and surface access in fading stenciled paint. At the end of a long, narrow tunnel, she found it. An iron security gate padlocked with a massive, ancient mechanism. Her hands shook so violently, she dropped the key twice. She could hear Elias dragging himself down the hall far behind her, leaving a thick trail of blood, wheezing a horrific death rattle. She shoved the rusted key into the padlock and turned. It ground fiercely against decades of rust, refusing to yield. "Please," Sarah sobbed, putting all her remaining body weight into turning the heavy iron key. "Please." With a sharp snap, the internal tumblers gave way. The lock popped open. Sarah threw the iron gate open and stepped into a vertical concrete shaft lined with a rusted iron ladder. She began to climb. She climbed for what felt like days. Her muscles screamed, her palms bled as the rusted rungs tore her skin open. Her vision faded in and out. But she kept climbing, driven by the faint, impossible smell of damp earth and pine needles drifting down from above. Hours later, the ladder ended at a heavy iron grate. Daylight, real, blinding, magnificent daylight poured through the slats. Sarah battered her bleeding fists against the grate, screaming until her vocal cords tore. Above ground, a state park ranger, who had noticed Sarah's abandoned Subaru 3 days prior and initiated a grid search, heard the muffled cries coming from a dilapidated concrete drainage pipe hidden in the brush. When the rescue team finally cut through the iron grate, they found Sarah Jenkins crumpled on the ladder, severely dehydrated, weighing 20 pounds less than when she went in, and completely unresponsive. Her hands were locked in a death grip around a massive, rusted key. In the hospital, it took Sarah 4 days to regain the ability to speak. When she finally opened her mouth, the authorities expected her to tell them about a cave-in. They expected a tragic story of unprepared hikers. Instead, she handed the FBI agents the rusted key and whispered a secret that would launch a classified congressional investigation, unearthing a Cold War nightmare that the government had spent 50 years trying to bury. She told them about Project Jericho. She told them about the caretaker. She was the only one who came back out of the dark. But every night, when Sarah closes her eyes, she is still down there, listening to the heavy footsteps echoing on the concrete. Do you think you could have survived 6 days in the pitch-black depths of a forgotten bunker? The psychological toll of absolute darkness is something few can comprehend. If this survival story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends who love real-life mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales of survival. Stay safe out there.